Welcome back. This is chapter 2 of making a kilt pleated to the set. Now, today is the 13th, Wednesday the 13th, because if you remember the last episode, I concluded that I was heading out the door to go to Remembrance Day, which for me these days is a very private affair. I got several old soldiers' graves I go and say hi to every year, and then went down to the local where the VPD and other marching teams after the ceremony they meet for a pint. And yeah, I sort of boldly assumed that I would just like have a glass and come home, but I fell in with a bunch of my old comrades, and in the words of Hilaire Belloc, I sat and drank with men who were boys when I was a boy, and so consequently I didn't get anything else accomplished that day. And yesterday, the 12th, I elected to just sit and read. Yeah, so, but here we are back again. So, remember in the last episode, I'd laid out the aprons. I'd calculated, or at least roughly calculated the deep pleat. But thinking about it, because the waist is 44, and initially I'd said, let's break it in half, 22 apron, 22 pleats. But thought for a bit, it says, no, I'm more comfortable with a 23 apron, 21 across the pleats, because again, I'm an ex-army kilt maker. I prefer a very, just maybe not disproportionately large, but I prefer the aprons to be more than 50%. So 23, 21 at the waist, 24, 23 at the hip, because this hip is 45. So, and then the next thing, because remember I had laid out the front apron based on the strongest, centered on the strongest element, in this case the white stripe, and I'd laid out the inner apron I'd gone half a set over, because the inner apron doesn't matter and it gives us a little extra cloth if need be. But having done so, there was the edge of my inner apron at the waist. I don't know if you can see this, but there isn't quite enough cloth. I want a full handspan to be folded over. And on top of that, I'm going to be taking off about a palm's width, about 4 inches, to form those two strips. So I moved the center of the inner apron over half set back to the white line, and now at 23, my edge of the apron comes just outboard of the red line, and as you can see, there's my cloth for the fringe. So good. So having done that, I recalculated my meeting place, remember, and very roughly, so I placed it there. Now when you're doing this, because there's so many, this is trying to avoid the words like complicated and more difficult and everything else, but there is a lot more to think about than when you're pleating to the stripe. Because if you're pleating to the stripe, it's quite straightforward. You know, you select what stripe you're going to be pleating to, you lay out the aprons, and then you count the number of, well, I just dropped all my chalk. You count the number of repeats between the aprons, in this case the number of the white lines, and whatever that number is, that can be the number of pleats you have. So whether it's 25 or 27 or 31, you know that you can have that number of pleats, because in each case you're pleating to the same point of the tartan. But when we're pleating to the set, we have to have the feature, the strongest feature, in this case the white line, which is centered on the front apron, also has to be centered in the back at the middle pleat. So we have to find that middle pleat, and then B, when we count those, we know we're not going to get the same number of pleats. If we've got, in this case, there's 25 repeats. I've already done it. But I know pleating to the set, if I was pleating to the stripe, sure, 25 pleats. But I'm pleating to the set, I'm going to maybe get 23 pleats, possibly 21. And for all of my experience, I can't confidently predict, I can't state with absolute conviction Okay, 25 potential. I can't say with absolute conviction if it's going to be 21 actual. I have to plot it out empirically, right? So yeah, so 25. But if it's 20, okay, 25 maximum. Well, let's start with 23, right? So 23 with this handy dandy sheet, 23 pleats. Well, obviously a 1-inch pleat gives us 23, which is our waist. In this case, it's our hip measurement. So I can start plotting with 1 inch. I go up, I'm looking for 21 because it's, again, the apron at the waist is 23 apron, 21 across the pleats. I'm looking for 21. I get 20 and 1/8, but that's okay because there's a couple of cheats, shall we say, that I'll show you about, which I've already mentioned, actually measuring to one side or the other of the chalk line. But also, if we want it to come out short rather than come out over, but it comes out short, no matter what the final result is. If it's, we want it to be slightly short. Sometimes, despite our efforts, it might be slightly over, but that's okay because unless it's too dramatic, we can make it up by just adjusting, changing the width of the aprons to suit. So tentatively right now, I'm going with 23. Yeah, I got 23 at the hip, so 1 inch at the hip, and it looks like 7/8 at the waist. Cool. So I put that away. The next thing I'm going to do, this is a fairly simple tartan. It's a little bit to pleat to because it's not terrifically busy. I mean, we have the major element, the white, two major elements, the white and the red. And as far as minor elements, well, we've got the transitions here. You know, we've starting in the white line, we have an expansive green, we have two double black lines, we have black, blue, red, blue, black, the double white line, double black lines, an expansive green, and then white again. Now remember, we absolutely must not pleat the kilt so that an element of the tartan vanishes into the pleat, like that, where we've got, hang on, you know, where we've got, there's a dramatic example of, and that's absolutely unacceptable. We're not going to do that. We will not do that. So what I do is, I mean, there's various ways to block out the pleats. Some people use a more mathematical method. Again, I'm empirical. So I'm going to start with my gauge. And again, these are tremendous. I've talked about them elsewhere. I've made these out of thin red cedar veneer because I happen to have a whole box of it at the time. But you could also make this out of cardstock. You could, you know, cut up an empty cereal packet and make a set of these things. Graduated in eighths from, let's say, 3/8 to an inch. Sometimes you'll find yourself actually having to do 1 1/8, 1 1/4, 1 1/2. But if you've got a set of these graduated in eighths, it makes things so much easier. So what I've done is I've gone to the inner apron end of the cloth, as you can see. And, well, the first thing I do, I'm going to take my gauge. I'm going to mark it with my recently sharpened piece of chalk and check it with my tape measure. So this says 1 inch. And it is centered on the chalk lines. It's bang over. It's an inch. If I sewed it, or if I was that when I was folding the kilt, if I folded the cloth so that both chalk lines were hidden by the seam, I would have what's that? 15/16. If I measured to the outside of the chalk, and this is with sharp chalk, I would have 1 inch and 1/16. So, and as the chalk gets duller, the line gets wider, and with practice you can actually use that to your advantage. So there have been times when I've had a kilt with very, very little taper, just let's say less than 1/8 of an inch taper, over 8 or 9 inches. And what I've done is, in cases I've had a piece of chalk with a sharp side and a dull side. So at the hip, I'll make a mark with the dull side, and at the waist, I'll make a mark with a sharp side, so that when I'm pleating to it, I'm getting just that. I'm getting just that a reliable deviation, shall we say? If these were both, let's say, both 1 inch, by measuring to the outside of the chalk here of a coarse piece of chalk and measuring to the inside or on the line of a fine piece of chalk, we're going to get that taper that we need. So, okay, so having done that, now I'm going to take, again, I'm at the other end of the cloth, because do you remember at the other end of this 8 yards of cloth, that top strip, or that strip, is going to wind up being my top band. Now I could do this at the other end of the cloth, but I would want to iron out this chalk before I put it on the kilt. Something else to, so let's just avoid that by going to the other end of the cloth. So what I've done is, starting with what will be the center of the apron and the center of the back, the white, I've marked I've marked it so that if this was a pleat, it would be centered on the white. Now, starting with that chalk line, I go over and see where it lands, because we have quite an expanse here, right? The only way I'm going to reliably find this each time is, let's say I've just done this pleat. I use that chalk line and bring it over and mark it. And then sometimes I have to do that a couple of times, because if we don't do this, if we just sort of eyeball it, we do have a lot of green, we got, what, a couple inches there? Yeah, just 1 7/8 inches of green there. If there's too much variation, even though it looks even on the outside, the pleat on the inside is going to be a different depth. And A, it catches the eye, and B, frankly, it's just not best practice, right? So I mark, and I'll be covering this again as I'm actually laying out all the pleats. So okay, so I center that. I use that chalk as a reference. I center that. Now I'm coming to a point here where you can see there's the 2 black lines and the transition from green to black. There's 2 ways I could do that. One, in this particular case, I could line up the edge of the gauge with that transition between black and green, or I could center the gauge on the middle. I'll just do it in contrasting colors, between those 2 black lines. Either way works, because as we lay out the pleats, it's not absolutely essential, it's not required that the scale of the tartan as it is displayed across the pleats, it doesn't have to be the same scale as the cloth. You've got a bit of variation because it's tapered anyway. It's not going to be exactly the same at one point of the taper in any case. But you have a bit of wiggle room. You can expand or you can shrink the scale of the tartan as you're doing this. So okay, so I've done that for each of these. So I came to I worked my way left from the white line, and I had done that here. Now, thing is, when I come to a major element, I want it to be centered on the pleat. I don't want it to be offside if I can possibly help it, because it's going to catch the eye, and not in a good way. So remember, okay, so I went 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if I did the same trick again with chalk and then laying it over, the red line would be off center, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to center that pleat on the red line. There's a bit of a discrepancy in depth here, but again, it doesn't matter, right? So, and then we carry on. So from the red line, well, the next pleat would take me up to that line, but what would happen with that double line? Is it going to be centered on the next pleat, or is it going to be offset? Well, the answer is do what you did over here, because, and I call this book matching. And book matching is from woodworking, where you take a piece of attractively figured wood. Let's say it's, a 2x4, and you saw it down the middle along its long axis, so that when you open it up, the grain, the pattern each is a mirror of the other because you've taken these two grains and opened it. So by starting, again, so I started at a center on the major element, and I'm working my way, and I see that it's not going to be quite centered on the major element, so I made a correction. And then moving from here, well, I could either, and this, of course, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 repeats that I would center the chalk on the white line and then work my way back, as we saw there, where that's centered, and I use that as a line and mark it, and then I use that. So I think actually just as well I took yesterday off, having been somewhat elevated. It's really true. In order to teach, in order to understand something, you really have to teach it, because I've been doing this intuitively for decades. But with the prospect of this video, I've had to sort of slow down and go, okay, smart arse, how are you actually doing this? So, right. So I'm going to put this stuff to one side. Now you remember when I was laying out the cloth, I counted the repeats, and it came to an even number. So I think it was 14 and 14 from either side, something like that. And I said, so, and I'd made a mark, and then I also made a mark to the let's call it the major element, in this case the white line, because we need a center pleat, and that major, the white line in this case, has to be centered on that pleat. We can't measure that in half and then translate this to have the center back element as a red line, different from the front line. It doesn't matter, I guess, because, but at the same time, no, we're not going to do that. So when you're faced with two choices for center, because you've counted from each direction and you got the same number and you came there and there, you pick the right hand one, because remember when we're pleating that way and we come to the last pleat, it comes to the meeting point and then to the apron. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a center pleat, and I'm going to chalk the pleats at this top band. I'm not chalking down here yet. You can chalk down here, but eventually, because you don't always get it right the first time, and sometimes even the second time. So if you get too many chalks down here, you're going to have to remove the chalking before you do the final marks, because it's fatally easy to be misled by when there's too many marks, right? So I do it up here. Okay, so that was centered. So the next one, and the next one, and I think I'm going to decide. I'm going to center this next pleat on that double track. The next one, no, centered on. I'm just going to do it on that side and that side. Now, as you can see, if I went to the next pleat and just lined up on the chalk marks, it would be horribly offset. So I'm going to correct it. I'm going to go back to center. I think this is actually a good choice for tartan for explaining this, because I could show you some other tartans which aren't immediately apparent. Actually, let me grab one. Hang on a minute. Look at this one. It's very busy, and laying out the pleats is going to be a good deal more complicated. I haven't found out from this fellow how he wants it pleated yet. if he chooses it to the set, we'll get to go through that adventure together, won't we? Okay. Okay, so my last one was centered on the red. Now it's really easy to make a mistake, either to repeat an element, you know, or to advance two, or to drop back one. It can be a pain in the backside. So remember what I did on the other side of the red. I'd centered on the double black. So that's what I'm going to do here. But I'm centering on the double black, and then I move over, right? And then here, centered on the double black. And here, it's going to be in that green. But remember, I want to avoid error in this green. So I could, yeah, I could mark it that way, having centered the thing on the previous element, right? Now let's see what would happen. Okay, that worked out nicely, because centering the center mark on that double line and then marking the next pleat, I double checked it by centering it on the white, which is going to be over here actually. But the lines just about line up, so that's a fortuitous accident. And I think actually that's a teaching point right there, because there's various ways to approach this. Again, some people do an entirely mathematical way, and the element, an example being this, our table of pleat widths that I encourage you to write out. So if you know you got 25 pleats, and you're looking, you know, you want 25 pleats to cover 21 or 22 inches, and you just run your finger down the scale, and you see that 7/8 is the width that you want. You can also do that backwards if you're using, and the great thing about using your gauges and using the chart is that you might find, especially with that, we're going to see that with that really busy tartan, you might find that the breakdown, the guide here, that it looks like your waist is going to be 20 1/4 and your hip is going to be 23 5/8. You might find that 23 5/8 being a 7/8 width and a 3/4 width. But you might find that those gauges don't really work for it, because they're not, shall we say, a comparable and equitable scale to the scale of the tartan. You might find out that you're creating a bit more work for yourself. And therefore, I'm not stating this as an absolute, but therefore, one thing you can consider is if you use those gauges and the gauges as you're laying it out, it doesn't seem to be going because of the relative busyness of the tartan. Try different widths. Pay a little less attention about how you know, the figure on the scale, and try a different width. So, you know, go down one or go up one, and see if that makes the whole process easier, because then at the end of it, all you really have to do is adjust that apron, and you're done and dusted. Now I'm going to keep doing this until I get to, well, let's find out. I'm going to keep doing this basically until I run out of material. And by that I mean until well, it looks like I'm getting there now, because that's the place I'd marked as being the first pleat. Let's see how it translates. This one was there. Cool. And if I went here, I marked as the last pleat compared to that. Let's see what happens. I'm going to mark one more pleat. Centered on the red. Let's put that out of the way for a minute. Now, I've stopped here because there's my apron marks. I've chalked out the apron, and this is, yep. Okay, so there's the edge of the apron. If I go there, far too shallow. If I go there, that's pretty good. That's better than I'd hoped for, because remember, when I was tentatively laying these things out, I started based on as if I was pleating into the stripe. It's a place to start, and it's like any scientific process, any experiment. You start with the known and you proceed to the unknown. So I'm familiar with pleating to the stripe. I start with that, and then I start playing with it. So yeah, remember initially the apron pleat was ridiculously deep. This is manageable. There's the center of the kilt. It's almost exactly a third. Brilliant. So this, therefore, is now my first pleat. And we're going to disregard that. Good. Let's see how many pleats I wound up with. 1, 2, and when I'm doing this, I'm also making sure that with each pleat, I'm progressing across the tartan. It's fatally easy to repeat it. So let's see, that one's off of the red, that one's centered on the black. It's easy to draw the wrong side of the line. So you have 2 centered off the black, and it's not till if you don't catch it, you'll find it out later when you're sewing, right? Because when a kilt is pleated to the set, if it's properly done, let's say that's sewn seam, that's the fell seam. If you lift up the pleat, see this pleat's centered on the black. When you lift up the cloth, you should see the same element of the tartan underneath. And if you don't, a mistake has been made. Right, so where was I? I'm simultaneously counting, and I'm checking my repeats. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, there goes the cloth rocketing off the end of the table. Hold on a second. Okay. Half a minute. I'm just going to put my iron on the cloth so that it doesn't disappear again. Okay, there's our center back. Cool. So there's the center. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So 11 plus 11 is 22, plus the center pleat is 23. Okay, cool. Looks like we're actually, at this point, it looks like we're actually going to have those 23 pleats. I have done this, started with a number, let's say 27, and wound up with 23 or even 21. I haven't quite figured out how that works yet. I'm not sure. I'm more of an observer than a thinker, perhaps, some days. So the next stage is, okay, I've sorted out that end. I'm going to do the same thing on this side, because now by repeating this whole process, I want to see if what's going to happen at the other end, whether or not it's going to affect the depth of the inner apron, but also if I'm going to run out of cloth. You know, if I'd started here, I'd almost certainly run out of cloth. And this, again, this is just long experience, that as soon as I see, you know, I've counted from either end and came to the same count, 14 and 14, I immediately just go for the right-hand one, because that eliminates a bit of annoyance and confusion later. So let's carry on from there. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Great thing about this too is if you have to adjust your pleat widths, it's not going to change the number of pleats, because you've already calculated where you've already shown. It's not even a calculation, isn't it? You're just empirically finding these things. You've already determined where the center of each pleat is going to be. Pardon me. Now, see that little wobble in the cloth there? That was uneven tension on the loom. That's going to be that's not going to be in the finished kilt. But again, that's something I could correct by manipulating, wetting and manipulating the cloth and ironing it. It would shift it. I lost count. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, there's 11. Well, that's neat. There is the meeting place that I had predicted. Well, that's even better. That's the meeting place I first predicted. I can't claim any. I can't claim any victory there. That was, I'm going to say, totally random. Although subconsciously, yeah, decades of experience, I made that chalk, and I was I was exactly right. Yeah, sorry, hubris. So that's my last pleat. There's the meeting pleat, or the meeting mark. And then my apron, and once again, there's my center, the meeting. The deep pleat is, again, almost precisely a third of the size of the inner apron. Remember, later I'm going to make the inner apron just an inch wider for reasons I've already mentioned, so that the left-hand strap doesn't pinch the shirt or the client. One more thing I want to check. There's my last pleat on the left, and it is 1 over from centered on red. Let's go look at the other end. Okay, there's my first pleat, and it's 1 over from centered on red. There's my last pleat, 1 over, the opposite direction, of course, centered on red. This is an important thing to check, because if you chalk out your pleats and you discover that this one isn't the mirror image of that one, you've made a mistake. You've either doubled, or you've laid down a chalk. You've either doubled a repeat, or you've either doubled a pleat, or you've skipped a pleat. So 1, 2, they're the same. I'm confident that we got that right. So, right, cool. The next thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to transfer these marks, which are at the top edge of the cloth. Remember, this is going to be ripped off. I'm going to transfer these marks onto the kilt itself, onto the kilt cloth itself. Now, my length is 22. My fell is 9. right? And now, make sure that I'm only drawing on a single layer of cloth. Okay, there's the bottom of the center pleat, bottom of the fill. Confusing things here by having too many chalk gauges. Right? So I'm gonna transfer these marks down here, and I'm gonna do that with every pleat. Not only, I'm not gonna like eyeball and run them down. I'm gonna see where that is, and then mark from scratch up there, and centered there, and centered there, and there, and there. Oh, I did that wrong. Got to be symmetric. And here, and here, and right. I almost skipped an element of the design. Look at me. And there's my last pleat. Right there. Okay. First pleat, I should say. And $22 and 9 and 2.5. Pull down my leather gauge. There's my buttonhole. And 9 and 2.5. Okay, there. So I marked half of it. From here, I'm going to go on and do the same thing on the other half of the kilt to the left of the center line as we're looking at it now. And then I'm going to take a break, because the next stage, having completely chalked it out, is to rip it to height. And it's funny, for all the years I've been doing this, it always fills me with anxiety before I rip it. Okay, there we are. I don't think you guys need to see me repeat this on the other half, do you? You're going to see it. Right. I can review this video to see if anything was in frame. Yeah.